This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 888 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into the questions this week, this is another reminder to check out Underdog Fantasy. I've got a legit offer for you. As you know, the Late Round Draft Guide is currently available for pre-order for $19.99. It's the piece of content that I put the most time into each year by far. You can get that guide for absolutely free if you've never played an Underdog. Here's how you do it. Head to UnderdogFantasy.com and sign up. When you sign up, use promo code LATEROUND and then make a deposit. On July 1st, when that guide launches, you'll get an email with a link to download the guide. You'll also be getting a deposit offer when you make that deposit. So there's really nothing to lose here, especially if you're planning on getting that draft guide anyway. So check it out, UnderdogFantasy.com, or download the Underdog app. When you sign up, make a deposit, and then use promo code LATEROUND. And then get your best ball on. Best ball drafts are a lot of fun. You've probably heard me talk about them on Becoming a Best Ball Bro. You can do it too. UnderdogFantasy.com, promo code LATEROUND. The first question this week is from Patreon. It's from NicoTV17. It says, "Hi JJ, love the show and your content. Thanks. In your episode 886, you talked about how RB1s hit at a very high rate compared to ADP expectation and versus later round running backs. I was wondering if this year it makes sense, from your view, to go running back in round 1 and round 2 in redraft. Since the round 2 wide receivers are so uncertain, and there's a lot of depth at wide receiver, and especially in a position in the draft around 7 to 9, where it's very possible to get Brees and Bijan in round 1 since everyone is going wide receiver at the top. Thanks." So I do want to be clear here at the top that round 1 running backs aren't necessarily better at exceeding ADP expectation because their expectation is much, much higher. But round 1 running backs are definitely better at giving you high-end fantasy seasons. And my research has shown that if you have a high-end RB1 in fantasy football, it's arguably the biggest advantage that you can get. Now, can you go RB-RB? Or should you go RB-RB? I think one thing to remember is that our redraft leagues this year won't be going exactly how best ball drafts are going. Like, yeah, you might see Bijan, Brees Hall go in that mid-first round range. But the people who aren't sick for this game and just draft in August every year, they love their running backs. Players like Kyren Williams, Saquon Barkley, Jonathan Taylor, maybe even Derrick Henry, they're bound to go higher than they're currently going on Underdog. So your opportunity cost equation is changing. Maybe instead of choosing between Saquon Barkley and Deebo Samuel, we're choosing between Saquon Barkley and Puka Nacua or Garrett Wilson. And if that's the case, I'm going to side with those wide receivers. And in most cases, I'm going to still side with those wide receivers. Just because there's some ambiguity in round 2 this year doesn't mean there won't be hits from that area of the draft or from some of those higher end wide receiver 2s. And let's be honest, there's a lot of ambiguity with the running backs after Brees Hall and Bijan Robinson fall off the board. Jahmyr Gibbs is a safe bet for a floor, but is the ceiling as comfortable as we want it to be with David Montgomery in that backfield? Kyren Williams had a bad prospect score. We know that's predictive. He also has Blake Corum to deal with. What if Devon Achane splits that backfield more than we expect? And Saquon Barkley and Jonathan Taylor, they're dealing with mobile quarterback threats who, number 1, may not dump it off as much, and number 2, might steal some touchdowns. So yeah, the wide receivers in round 2 are definitely up in the air, but so are the running backs. That's why I don't think it's necessary to just zig when others zag. But at the end of the day, your league type, the structure, the scoring, that should dictate a lot of this. Can you get away with a running back start this year? Sure. It's not some wild idea. I get this question a lot, and people are acting like it's some crazy notion to go RB-RB. But is it the way that I'm going to be drafting most frequently? Almost definitely not. This next question is from Matt M, also on Patreon. It says, "I have a general strategy question that I want to understand how you approach. How often are you accounting for the math in terms of quarterback plus their weapons as it relates to rankings? Said another way, how much impact does a proven quarterback elevate your rankings and projection of their weapons? even if those weapons are unproven, such as Marvin Harrison Jr. The same question for a team's weapons, take the Vikings for example, in terms of elevating their unproven quarterback in JJ McCarthy. Is it simply just a balance thing, or do you ever say, hey, the math here doesn't add up, how can Josh Allen be QB1 and at the same time, not a single wide receiver from Buffalo going in the top 40 wide receivers, and then adjust? So I think what's being asked here is, if we have wide receivers and pass catchers from a team going early, and then the quarterback is going late, does that mean that we're wrong about that quarterback? Or maybe we're wrong about the pass catchers? Because the math just doesn't seem to add up. And the opposite is true too. You have Josh Allen as this early round pick, but his wide receivers aren't being drafted super early. I think the first thing to remember is that not all teams are alike, and not all talent is alike. With Minnesota, for example, people are going to be bullish on Justin Jefferson because he's freaking Justin Jefferson. Meanwhile, look at the team's weapons. Jordan Addison doesn't have that much competition. TJ Hockenson is coming off an injury where he won't be healthy to start the year, more than likely. What that means is that targets are being funneled to very specific players in that offense. Both Jefferson and Addison have a chance to capture large target shares, so they're going to be drafted earlier. That doesn't mean the quarterback has to also be good, because in this specific case, Addison and Jefferson are winning through volume. I mean, Jefferson's going to win regardless because he's a monster, but Addison in particular, he's going to win through volume. It's really a volume and offensive environment play. It's less about the talent profile, though he's a fine player. Just look at the Dolphins. They're always a great example with this. Miami has 2 top 15 wide receivers in Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. Why isn't Tua being drafted as a top 10 quarterback? Well, because their success doesn't necessarily mean that Tua is going to be a beast in fantasy football. It's just that the 2 wide receivers are bound to capture a massive target share in their offense, and they're incredibly efficient receivers. With Josh Allen, number 1, technically he does have an early round pass catcher getting picked in Dalton Kincaid. But number 2, he's a mobile quarterback. We're drafting Josh Allen because of what he can bring to the table as a rusher. It's very possible that Allen is a good fantasy quarterback this year without having a super usable wide receiver. In fact, just look at what happened last year when Joe Brady took over as offensive coordinator. With Brady, Allen ended up scoring 1.5 more points per game. But Bills wide receivers saw their rate of giving fantasy managers a top 24 performance get cut in half. During the first part of the season, they averaged 1.4 top 24 performances per game. That was 0.7 with Joe Brady. And we saw that down the stretch when Stephon Diggs wasn't as valuable. What's more important with this stuff is sort of at the extremes, when the market works together to give us some insight. What I mean by that is, if you have a quarterback getting drafted late and he doesn't have any pass catchers getting drafted early, and I talk about this in the draft guide for the record, but if he doesn't have a pass catcher with a high ADP, that's a problem. Because that's telling us that he likely doesn't have some stud player in that offense. And obviously, stud players are going to help a quarterback. Those quarterbacks late end up performing a whole lot worse than the alternative. Every once in a while, you're going to get a CJ Stroud type year, but that's pretty uncommon. So I hope that answers your question. At the end of the day, you have to still focus on what the quarterback does well and why these players are being drafted where they are. How condensed things are from a target distribution standpoint, that matters a lot, as does quarterback rushing. This next question is from Twitter, is from @gmark4311. Could Malachi Corley function like a Randall Cobb-esque Wooby for Aaron Rodgers? If so, wouldn't that make him a tremendous steal as late as he's going in drafts? Thanks. Well, Randall Cobb wasn't exactly Randall Cobb in year 1. He had 31 targets and he scored once. Now, he competed with some really good players, but I think that's still important to note. Partially because Corley himself is a pretty raw prospect. He didn't run a full route tree in college, and he did so against inferior competition. He's definitely got that dog in him. He's a great yards after the catch player. But if I'm trying to be rational, level-headed, I think a lot of what we're going to see in year 1 is sort of manufactured stuff for Corley, at least during the front portion of the season. Not only that, but Randall Cobb was a pretty good prospect. He had a ZAP score of 81.7. He was an early declare wideout. He showed off a lot of versatility at Kentucky. and he didn't go to a smaller program like Corley did. According to my prospect model, because of Corley's strength of competition, he technically never broke out. Cobb's breakout score was about average. Now, I'm open to being wrong about Corley, and I'm not going to fault anyone for a later round pick, especially in a stack. But I think you could make ceiling arguments for a lot of rookie wideouts who are being drafted late, or just wide receivers in general. So I'll have some exposure to Corley this year in best ball because I do think spiked weeks could happen with this archetype. Like I said, he's a good yak player. He should get some cheaper touches in that offense. But I don't think that we're looking at a league-winning type player. I don't think missing out on Corley this year is necessarily going to burn you. This last question is an email from Dan. It says, after listening to your running back dead zone episode, do you favor Tyjae Spears over Tony Pollard and Chase Brown over Zach Moss because they are second-year backs that were drafted by their team as opposed to free agency signings, since these backs will be selected in the dead zone? So remember, the analysis I talked about on that show focused more heavily on RB2s, and it focused heavily on cost itself. Overall, we generally want second-year running backs after that RB1 range. We want pass catchers too, and we want ambiguous backfields, because in these ambiguous backfields, prices are falling for players because they're ambiguous. The market hates ambiguity. I still prefer a player like Moss straight up to Chase Brown, because I still look at these macro trends and then dive into the individual player and the individual circumstance itself. With that being said, I think the gap between Moss and Brown and the gap between Pollard and Spears especially, those gaps should be shrunk. In other words, at cost, I prefer Spears and I probably prefer Brown. The Tennessee backfield in particular has been really interesting to me this offseason because everyone loved Tyjae Spears before free agency. He was a dynasty darling, and everyone hated Tony Pollard last year because he couldn't score touchdowns. Then all of a sudden, people are more into Pollard than Spears, when the Titans themselves have called those two running backs interchangeable. When Spears is the younger of the two, when Spears is coming off a rookie season with a really good target share, and we want pass-catching backs, especially in the middle rounds. Now, I'm not saying it's obvious that one is better than the other, but I legitimately think that it's a coin flip between those two players. And notice that it doesn't have anything to do with the dead zone itself. Remember, all of this is about probability. We don't need to fade every single dead zone running back. If you go back to the research that I was talking through, high-end RB2s who aren't first or second year players, so guys in that RB13 to RB18 range, they get you 16 or more PPR points per game at about a 15% clip. The next group, the veteran low-end RB2s, it's 10.5%. And the rate of getting to 14 or more PPR points per game for those low-end RB2s, really not that much different than RB3s and high-end RB4s. That's the macro trend. I know that I'm kind of going all over the place here, but I think this is really important because whatever you took away from that episode is the thing that I care about most. And if the takeaway was to prefer an RB3 or an RB4 straight up to an RB2, that's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that when you get into that mid-range RB2 area, even in the upper end of that area, if you can't get a young running back, you've generally been better off waiting a couple of rounds for a running back because the cost changes. The benefit does change, but not nearly as much as the cost. You're getting similar output for a cheaper cost. So instead of getting a running back there, you might want to go with a different position in order to extract value. This doesn't mean that you then prefer RB4s. You shouldn't prefer RB4s over RB2s in general, even if those RB2s are smack dab in the dead zone. And even when those RB4s check a lot of the market-related boxes that we look for. You still need to dig into each individual situation. Now, generally speaking, I'll probably like younger running backs in ambiguous backfields more than the market will. So I do like Tyjae Spears more than the market. And Chase Brown is fine too. But my preference for them is not while ignoring cost. Cost is always part of the equation. Because while the dead zone backs see a really big drop off in production versus the backs who get drafted right before them, they're still better bets in general than later round running backs. RB2s, while they're not that great, they're still better than RB3s. It's just the cost involved in getting them isn't really worth it. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. Enjoy your weekend. Happy Father's Day to all the dads out there. I'll talk to you next week.